The stench of cheap whiskey and iron-thick blood always lingered in the air before Kwon Ji-hoon's world fell apart. The Chicago rain lashed against the windshield of Jada's beat-up sedan like a warning, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and the desperate hustle of the South Side. Inside the iron-wrought gates of the Ji-hoon estate, silence suffocated the manicured lawns. Massive limestone pillars cast long, jagged shadows across floors of polished obsidian. No security greeted her. Only the low hum of a disconnected alarm system echoed through the vaulted foyer. Jada Reed moved through the opulence with practiced indifference. Her neon-orange delivery vest was faded, her braids tucked tightly under a rain-slicked cap. At 24, she had mastered the art of being a ghost in the city's machine, a skill essential for someone whose survival depended on delivering high-end packages to doors that never fully opened. She knew which porches were rigged with cameras, which doormen took bribes, and kept her eyes on the prize, though she noted every exit. The unwashed wine glass on the pedestal, the muddy boot prints on the white silk rug, the faint, muffled whimper of a child behind a mahogany door. Jada was just a girl on a route, a temporary fixture in a world of permanent secrets, until she stepped into the dining room and realized that tonight, the ghost was the only one left alive. The city was a jagged mouth of glass and steel, and Jada Reed knew exactly how to slip between the teeth. The clock on her dashboard flickered 11:47 p.m., the neon green numbers reflecting in the steady drizzle that turned Chicago's asphalt into a shimmering, oil-slicked mirror. Most people saw the South Side as a map of places to avoid, but to Jada, it was a series of rhythmically timed stoplights and back-alley shortcuts. She lived by a simple code: deliver fast, stay anonymous, and never look back at the houses once the door closed. It was a life of motion that kept the ghosts of her childhood, the sirens, the yellow tape, the weight of her father's tarnished badge at a distance. The ping from her delivery app was louder than usual, a sharp staccato that cut through the low hum of the heater. It wasn't a standard order. It was a priority executive handoff, a tier usually reserved for the downtown penthouses, but the GPS coordinates were pulling her toward the northern edge of the city, where the brownstones gave way to sprawling, fortified estates hidden behind walls of ivy and iron. The payout was triple her daily average, a figure that felt less like a tip and more like a bribe. Jada's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Her father used to say that when the money was too easy, the price was usually something you couldn't afford to pay. But rent was due, and the gas light was a glowing amber threat. She banked a sharp turn, the tires of her sedan splashing through a deep puddle, as she left the familiar grid of the neighborhood for the eerie, quiet lanes of the elite. As she approached the address, the GPS signaled she had arrived, but there was no gatehouse, no buzzing intercom. The massive wrought iron gates, usually shut tight against the world, stood ajar, swaying slightly in the biting November wind like a broken jaw. Jada slowed her car to a crawl. The headlights swept across a limestone driveway, illuminating a trail of dark, splattered droplets that looked black under the moonless sky. She should have turned around. Every instinct honed by years of urban survival screamed at her to put the car in reverse and vanish into the night. But then she saw the dining room window of the mansion. The golden glow of a chandelier was blinding against the darkness, and for a split second, a small pale hand pressed against the glass before being yanked away. Jada killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. She reached for the delivery bag in the passenger seat, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't just delivering dinner anymore. She was walking into a trap that had been set long before she even started the engine. The heavy oak doors groaned as Jada pushed them open, the sound swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence of the foyer. She didn't announce herself. The professional delivery for Kwon died in her throat as she followed the trail of dark droplets toward the light of the dining room. Every step on the obsidian floor felt like a heartbeat, loud and intrusive. When she reached the threshold, the scene froze her in place. This wasn't the polished sanctuary of a billionaire. It was a gilded cage moments after the predator had been cornered. At the head of the mahogany table sat Kwon Ji-hoon. The man she'd seen on news clips, sharp, untouchable, and lethal, was a wreck of loosened silk and shattered pride. His white dress shirt was stained crimson, his face bruised as if he'd been dragged through his own history. A bottle of expensive scotch sat open, the amber liquid pooling on the table from a glass he no longer had the strength to hold. "You're late," he rasped, his voice a jagged edge of gravel and glass. He didn't look at her. His bloodshot eyes were fixed on the four men standing in the shadows behind him. They were monoliths in black suits, their hands resting with practiced ease near the holsters of their jackets. Jada's gaze dropped. Beneath the table, clutching the fabric of Ji-hoon's trousers, was Alora. The girl was a portrait of silent terror, her wide eyes locked onto Jada's neon orange vest like it was a life raft in a sea of monsters. The contrast was absurd, the mundane reality of a delivery driver standing in the epicenter of a high-stakes execution. "The order said handoff," Jada said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the lightning strike of adrenaline hitting her veins. She stepped further into the room, the thermal bag heavy in her hand. "I don't leave until the customer signs." One of the men in suits stepped forward, the barrel of a suppressed pistol catching the light of the chandelier. "Leave the bag and walk away, girl. This doesn't concern you." Ji-hoon let out a low, dry chuckle that turned into a cough, spitting blood onto the white tablecloth. He finally looked up, and for a second Jada saw it, the sharp, predatory gleam behind the mask of drunkenness. It wasn't fear in his eyes, it was a countdown. "She doesn't just walk away," Ji-hoon whispered, his gaze burning into Jada's. "She's the one I've been waiting for." In that heartbeat, Jada realized the gates hadn't been left open by accident. The drunk man before her wasn't a victim of his vices. He was the architect of a collision. The men in suits shifted, sensing the change in the air. But Jada was already moving. She didn't drop the bag. She swung it. The thermal bag slammed into the lead gunman's jaw with the force of a brick, the heavy containers of bibimbap acting like a flail. In the chaotic heartbeat that followed, the room exploded. Jada didn't wait for the scream. She reached down, scooped Alora into her arm, and lunged for the collar of Ji-hoon's blood-stained shirt. "Move or die," she hissed, the command cutting through his alcohol-induced haze like a splash of ice water. Ji-hoon stumbled to his feet, his movements sluggish but driven by a sudden, primal surge of survival. They bolted through the side service door just as the first suppressed rounds whistled through the air, shattering the crystal chandelier behind them into 1,000 diamond-like shards. The golden light died, replaced by the flickering red of the emergency strobes. Jada's boots hammered against the obsidian floor as she led them through the labyrinth of the estate. She didn't head for the front gates. She knew they would be a kill zone. Instead, she swerved toward the underground garage, the scent of gasoline and cold concrete rising to meet them. "The SUV," Ji-hoon managed to choke out, pointing a trembling hand toward a matte black beast of a vehicle, a custom armored Range Rover. "Keys in the visor." Jada threw Alora into the back seat and shoved Ji-hoon into the passenger side before sliding behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, a low-frequency growl that shook the very foundations of the garage. As the heavy steel shutters began to rise, the four men in suits appeared in the rearview mirror, their muzzle flashes illuminating the dark like angry fireflies. The rear window spiderwebbed but held. Reinforced glass. Jada slammed the gear into reverse, fishtailing the massive vehicle around, and then floored it. They cleared the garage door just as it groaned shut, the SUV leaping onto the rain-slicked driveway. The heights were no longer a sanctuary. They were a hunting ground. Behind them, two sets of high-intensity LED headlights flickered to life. The council's cleaners were giving chase. "Can you drive?" Ji-hoon muttered, his head lolling against the headrest, though his eyes remained fixed on the child in the back. "I drive for a living, Mafia," Jada snapped, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather steering wheel. She cut the lights, plunging them into darkness as she veered off the main road and onto a steep, winding pedestrian path that bypassed the main gate. The SUV groaned, branches clawing at the expensive paint, but they broke through the tree line and onto the open highway. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a crown of electric jewels. Jada pushed the needle past 90, the wind howling against the armor. They weren't safe yet, but as the suburban fortress vanished into the rearview, the power dynamic had shifted. The delivery girl was no longer following a route, she was carving a new one through the throat of the night. The safe house was a concrete shell beneath an abandoned printing press, smelling of damp paper and old oil. Jada sat on a milk crate, her hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline ebbed away. Across the room, Alora had fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep on a pile of moving blankets. Ji-hoon stood by a narrow, high-set window, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face as he wiped blood from his temple with a piece of gauze. The drunken stupor from the mansion had vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory lucidity that made Jada's skin crawl. He wasn't stumbling anymore. He was vibrating with a quiet, lethal energy. "You're not drunk," Jada said, her voice echoing off the bare walls. It wasn't a question. The wine, the bruising. It was a performance. Ji-hoon turned, his dark eyes unreadable. "I needed the council to believe I was broken. A man who has lost his mind to the bottle is a man they underestimate. They came to finish a corpse, not fight a king." Jada stood up, her shadow stretching long against the floor. "And the delivery? You're telling me it was a coincidence that I showed up right when the guns came out? My app glitched 3 times on the way there. That wasn't the satellites, was it?" Ji-hoon stepped into the light, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a pawn, but as a masterpiece he had spent years studying. "I've been watching your route for 6 months, Jada. I knew which alleys you took to shave off 3 minutes. I knew you never missed a drop-off, even when the sirens were 2 blocks away." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a weathered laminated ID card. He slid it across the crate. It was her father's police credentials, the ones that had been missing since the night he was killed in a routine traffic stop. "Your father was the only man in this city I couldn't buy," Ji-hoon whispered. "When the council decided to purge me, I knew I couldn't trust my own blood. I needed someone with the Reed legacy. Someone who survives because it's in her DNA. I didn't just order food, Jada. I recruited the only person in Chicago who wouldn't sell me out to the highest bidder." The betrayal stung worse than the cold. Jada looked from the ID card to the man who had orchestrated her terror. "You used me. You put a child's life at risk just to see if I'd play my part." "I didn't use you," Ji-hoon corrected, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "I bet my life on you. And tonight we both won." Jada looked at Alora, then back at the man who had lured her into the heart of a mafia war. She realized with a sinking heart that the midnight rout hadn't ended at the mansion. It was only just beginning. Jada gripped the wheel, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Alora was curled in the back, her small hands over her ears as if she could tune out the tension radiating from the adults. "Let them look," Jada said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "They're looking for a delivery girl. They aren't looking for a Reed." She took the 18th Street exit at a speed that made the tires scream, diving into the industrial heart of the city where the streetlights were fewer and the shadows were deeper. This was the territory the GPS didn't understand. A labyrinth of loading docks, narrow viaducts and gravel lots. The city began to bleed its secrets. Black SUVs with tinted windows prowled the intersections like sharks in shallow water. A police cruiser sat idling under an overpass, its lights off, the officers inside looking not for crime, but for the payoff. Jada cut through a narrow alleyway, the side mirrors missing the brick walls by mere inches, bypassing a blockade the council had set up on the main thoroughfare. "We're being boxed in," Ji-hoon warned as a second set of headlights appeared. Chesame, the concrete walls of the safe house felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the metallic tang of old machinery and the heavy weight of Ji-hoon's revelations. Jada turned away from the man who had orchestrated her life like a H, her focus shifting to the only thing in the room that felt real. Alora. The little girl stirred on the pile of moving blankets, her small chest rising and falling in a jagged rhythm. She whimpered in her sleep, a tiny broken sound that sliced through Jada's anger. Jada knelt beside her, the rough fabric of her delivery vest crinkling as she reached out. She hesitated, her hand hovering over Alora's shoulder, before gently smoothing a stray curl away from the child's forehead. "She's the key, isn't she?" Jada asked, her voice a low vibration that didn't wake the girl. "She's not just some bystander you picked up. She's the reason the council came for you tonight." Ji-hoon remained by the window, his silhouette a sharp, dark blade against the moonlight. "She is the only daughter of the council's high chairman. After he was removed, she became a living piece of leverage. They don't want her dead. They want her as a puppet, a bloodline they can control to keep the families from warring." Jada's eyes flashed with a sudden protective heat. "She's a child, not a title. In my world there is no difference," Ji-hoon replied, turning to look at them. The coldness in his eyes flickered, softened by the sight of Jada's hand resting on the girl's arm. But you look at her and see a person. That is why I brought her to you. My men would have guarded her like a diamond in a vault. You are guarding her like a mother. Alora's eyes fluttered open then. The deep brown irises clouded with confusion until they landed on Jada. She didn't reach for the mafia boss. She reached for the woman who had swung a bag of bibimbap at a gunman. Her small fingers curled around Jada's thumb, anchoring herself to the only source of warmth she'd found in the dark. Are we going home? Alora whispered, her voice barely audible. Jada looked at the girl, then up at Ji-hoon. The home Alora knew was gone, replaced by bloodstains and betrayal. Jada felt the familiar weight of the city's darkness pressing in. But for the first time, she didn't want to run. She realized that if she walked away now, she wasn't just leaving a mafia war. She was abandoning a piece of herself that her father had tried to protect. We're going to find a new one, Jada promised, her voice firm. She looked back at Ji-hoon, the cynicism in her eyes replaced by a grim, focused resolve. But first, we're going to make sure no one ever comes for her again. Tell me what we have to do. Ji-hoon's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, not the manipulative smirk of a strategist, but the grim satisfaction of a general who had finally found his best soldier. The innocent stake had been placed, and the game was no longer about survival. It was about scorched earth. His safe house grew colder as the night deepened, the silence punctuated only by the low hum of a distant generator. Ji-hoon reached into the inner pocket of his tattered suit jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, its edges scorched and stained with time. He didn't hand it to Jada immediately. He held it with a reverence that bordered on pain. My father and yours weren't just on opposite sides of the law, Ji-hoon began, his voice dropping to a low melodic rumble. They were two men trying to solve the same equation from different ends. Your father, the detective who wouldn't look away. Mine, the ghost who saw too much. Jada took the notebook, her fingers trembling as she recognized her father's precise, cramped handwriting. It was filled with dates, shipping manifests, and names of men who now sat on the council. The trafficking ring wasn't just a side business for the syndicate, Ji-hoon explained, pacing the small circle of light. It was the foundation. Years ago, your father found the ledger that proved the city's elite were bankrolling the operations. He couldn't take it to his precinct, it was already compromised. So, he went to the one man the council feared more than the police, my father. Jada flipped through the pages, her breath catching as she saw a Polaroid tucked between the leaves. It was her father, younger and grittier, standing next to a stern-faced Korean man in a sharp overcoat. They weren't fighting. They were talking over a map of the Chicago docks. They formed a pact, Ji-hoon whispered. Your father provided the evidence, and mine provided the shadow warriors to dismantle the warehouses. But the council found out. They didn't just kill them, Jada. They erased the truth. They turned your father into a dirty cop, in the eyes of the public, and made mine look like a common thug who died in a turf war. The weight of the legacy Jada had spent a decade running from finally crashed down on her. The cynicism she wore like armor began to crack. She wasn't just a delivery girl caught in a crossfire. She was the daughter of a man who had sacrificed his reputation to save children like Alora. I didn't lure you here just to save myself, Ji-hoon said, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. I lured you here because this is your war as much as mine. The council is moving the final shipment tonight. The same docks, the same names. Our fathers started this fire. I think it's time we finished burning it down. Jada looked at the notebook, then at her father's badge. The shadow of Mitch Reed wasn't a burden anymore. It was a compass. She closed the book with a sharp snap and met Ji-hoon's gaze. Tell me where the docks are, she said, her voice like forged steel. I know a shortcut. The sanctuary of the print shop dissolved into the predatory neon of the Chicago skyline as they moved. Ji-hoon had swapped his ruined blazer for a dark tactical jacket, but Jada remained in her faded delivery vest, the perfect camouflage for a city that had learned to look past her. The air was thick with the scent of an approaching storm, and as they pulled the armored SUV onto the Dan Ryan Expressway, the city felt like it was hemmed in by invisible wires. The council hadn't just put a price on Ji-hoon's head. They had activated every corrupted cell in the metropolitan grid. Every police scanner hummed with a description of Jada's sedan, and digital billboards that usually flashed advertisements for luxury watches now felt like watchful, glowing eyes. "They've leaked your plates to the street gangs," Ji-hoon muttered, his eyes fixed on a black sedan that had been trailing them for 3 exits. "The council is offering $1 million finder's fee. To the streets we aren't people anymore. We're a lottery ticket." "I'm not boxed in," Jada retorted, her jaw set. "I'm just narrowing the field." She slammed the SUV into a hard left, crashing through a chain-link fence and onto the rusted tracks of an old rail yard. The sudden jolting woke Alora, who let out a small gasp. Jada's heart hammered, but her hands were steady. The city was bleeding, the corruption oozing from every corner, but the more the council tried to squeeze them, the faster they moved toward the one place where the shadows finally belonged to them, the docks. The roar of the engine died as Jada killed the ignition, the SUV coasting into the hollowed-out carcass of a shipyard warehouse. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of salt and rusted iron. Ji-hoon didn't step out immediately. He sat in the passenger seat, his head bowed, the dashboard's fading light catching the predatory stillness of his posture. The drunk facade had been a mask and the victim had been a role, but as he looked at the warehouse, the very place where his father's legacy had been buried in silence, the man who emerged was something far more dangerous. He stepped out of the vehicle, his movements no longer sluggish or calculated, but fluid and sharp. He pulled a heavy matte black case from the rear cargo area, snapping the latches with a clinical precision. Inside lay the tools of a sovereign, encrypted comms, a sleek semi-automatic, and a tablet glowing with the live feed of the city's underground infrastructure. "They think they are hunting a wounded animal," Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a cold authority that vibrated through the damp air. "They've forgotten that a dragon only sleeps to dream of the fire." He tapped a sequence into the tablet. Across the city, the invisible network he had spent years cultivating, the loyalists who had gone to ground when the council turned, began to flicker to life. Blue dots appeared on the map, converging on the docks. He wasn't just a man with a gun anymore. He was the nerve center of a counterinsurgency. Jada watched him, seeing the shift in his eyes. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a terrifying, focused clarity. He looked at Alora, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes, then at Jada. "You brought me through the teeth of the city, Jada," he said, handing her a small earpiece. "Now I need you to lead the way into its heart. My men are in position, but they are waiting for a signal only a reed can give." He didn't explain. He simply pointed to the horizon where the first of the council's cargo ships was docking, its silhouette a jagged tooth against the rising moon. The dragon was no longer waking. He was standing at full height, ready to reclaim his throne with the daughter of his father's only friend at his side. The night was no longer about fleeing. The hunt had inverted. "Check your mirrors, Jada," Ji-hoon whispered, a dark, satisfied glint in his eyes. "The city is ours now." The Chicago docks were a skeletal forest of rusted cranes and towering shipping containers, a landscape defined by shadows and the rhythmic, hollow groaning of metal. The rain had turned into a cold, needle-like sleet that blurred the horizon, but it couldn't hide the activity at Pier 14. Armed men in the council's tactical gear moved like ants around a massive, unmarked freighter, their flashlights cutting through the mist. Jada stood atop a rusted stack of containers, the heavy industrial wind whipping her braids against her cheeks. Beside her, Ji-hoon was a ghost in the dark, his presence anchored by the cold steel of the rifle in his hands. He wasn't looking at the cargo. His eyes were fixed on the men, the same men who had betrayed his father and tried to execute him in his own dining room. "The signal, Jada," Ji-hoon whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing of the lake against the pylons. Jada pulled the small, battered flare gun from her vest, the one her father had kept in his glove box for emergencies that never came. She didn't feel like a delivery girl anymore. She felt like a detonator. She aimed high into the obsidian sky and squeezed the trigger. A brilliant, searing red light arced over the pier, blooming like a dying star. The docks erupted. From the dark mouths of the surrounding warehouses, a fleet of delivery vans and nondescript sedans roared to life, their headlights blinding the council's guards. This was Jada's world, the drivers, the couriers, the invisible army of the city, acting as a chaotic shield. Amidst the confusion, Ji-hoon's loyalists moved in like a surgical strike. Jada didn't stay on the sidelines. She descended the containers with a fluid, practiced speed, Alora's safety burning in her mind like a brand. She intercepted a guard near the primary terminal, using the momentum of her descent to sweep his legs out. Before he could recover, she used his own momentum to send him into the freezing dark of the lake. "Quan!" a voice roared through the chaos. It was Baek Young, the council's primary enforcer, standing at the base of the freighter's ramp. Ji-hoon didn't hesitate. He dropped from his perch, landing in the oil-slicked slush with the grace of a predator. The confrontation was a blur of steel and concrete, the two men clashing with a ferocity that spoke of decades of suppressed rage. Young swung a heavy iron pipe, but Ji-hoon moved like smoke, his strikes precise and devastating. Jada reached the center of the fray just as Ji-hoon delivered a final, bone-crushing kick that sent Young sprawling against a shipping crate. The evidence, the ledger her father had died for, was right there, tucked into Young's tactical vest. Jada stepped forward, her boot pinning Young's hand to the concrete. She reached down and snatched the book, her eyes meeting Ji-hoon's. The war of steel and concrete was over. The truth was finally back in the hands of those who knew its cost. The sun rose over Lake Michigan not as a herald of warmth, but as a cold, pale light that stripped away the shadows of the night. The docks were silent now, the sirens of the state police fading into the distance along with the council's broken empire. Jada stood by the edge of the pier, the ledger tucked safely beneath her arm. The weight of her father's history no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a foundation. Ji-hoon approached her, his silhouette sharp against the morning mist. He had washed the blood from his hands, but the intensity in his eyes remained, a flame that had burned away the mobster and left behind something new. He looked at the ledger, then at Jada, and finally at Alora, who was sitting on the bumper of the SUV, wrapped in a thick wool blanket and watching the gulls circle above. "The council is gone," Ji-hoon said, his voice carrying the calm of a man who had finally stepped out of a storm. "The evidence in that book will ensure that no one ever sits in those chairs again. My father's debt is paid. Your father's name is cleared." Jada looked out at the city skyline. "So what happens now? Does the dragon just find a new cave?" Ji-hoon stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "The dragon is retiring. I'm liquidating the syndicate's assets. The money that was built on blood will be used to build something clean. Schools, clinics, a future for children like Alora who were born into the dark." He paused, looking at her with a sincerity that made the breath hitch in her throat. "And I want you to run the foundation with me. No more deliveries, Jada. No more ghosts." Jada looked at Alora, who smiled for the first time, a small hesitant spark of hope. The midnight route had led Jada to a destination she never could have mapped out. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was an architect. "I don't work for free," Jada said, a faint, challenging smile touching her lips. "You'll be a partner," Ji-hoon promised, his hand finding hers. "In everything." They turned away from the water together, walking toward the child who had bridged two broken worlds. Behind them, the rusted cranes of the docks stood like monuments to a war that was finally over. The city was waking up, but for Jada Reed and Kwon Ji-hoon it was a new order. They weren't just two people who had survived the night, they were the ones who had chosen to stay for the dawn. Not as pawns of the past, but as authors of a story that finally belonged to them.